Ray had never been the type to wander into danger willingly, but something about the crumbling alien marketplace tugged at his curiosity. The thick storm clouds rolled above him, casting a gloomy shadow over the ruined structures. The wind howled through the broken windows of what had once been a bustling trading post on the far edge of the galaxy, now left in a state of decay. Ray's boots echoed on the cracked stone as he made his way deeper into the remains of the market. He had come looking for supplies, not expecting to find much in this desolate place. But when his eyes caught sight of a figure crouching near the entrance of an old building, his steps faltered. There, kneeling on the cold ground, was a young alien woman. Her clothes were ragged, stained with dirt, and something far worse. Her skin, once a beautiful shade of violet, now looked worn and tattered from a harsh environment. Her long hair, tangled and wild, framed a face that was both haunting and stunning. But it wasn't her beauty that struck Ray first. It was the desperation in her eyes. Her head was lowered, as though she were ashamed to be seen, yet her gaze locked onto his as he approached. "Please," her voice was barely a whisper, cracking with the dryness of her throat. "Please, take me. I will serve you." Ray's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. A human like him wasn't accustomed to such words coming from anyone, let alone a stranger in the middle of an alien marketplace. His first instinct was to turn away, dismissing her as just another beggar trying to survive in a harsh world. But something about her, something in the way she looked up at him, kept him rooted to the spot. "Why?" he asked, his voice soft but confused. "Why me? What do you want from me?" She hesitated, her hands trembling as they rested on the ground. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and her eyes flickered nervously. "They are coming for me," she whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "They'll kill me if they find me here. Please, I can cook, I can clean, I can fight if you want. I'll do anything. Just please, don't let them take me." Ray looked around, his instincts screaming at him to leave, to not get involved in whatever mess this alien woman was wrapped up in. But he couldn't walk away. There was something in the way she spoke, something in the desperation of her voice that made him hesitate. He took a cautious step closer. "Who's coming for you?" he asked. "Members of my planet's royal family," she said, her voice trembling. "I broke their laws. I've been banished. I'm nothing now, just a fugitive." Ray furrowed his brow. "Banished? From your planet?" The alien girl nodded slowly, her eyes welling up with tears. She quickly blinked away. "I was once a noble, but I couldn't live with what they did to the others. I tried to stop them. I tried to free the slaves, but they caught me. They killed him, my brother, the only person who ever loved me for who I am." Her voice broke as she said the last words, and she quickly turned her face away to hide the tears. Ray stood there, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to help, to offer her comfort, but he wasn't sure he could trust her. She was an alien, after all, and who knew what kind of trouble she was bringing with her? Before he could decide what to do, a loud noise cut through the air. Footsteps, sharp and quick. Ray's head snapped to the side. A group of armed soldiers, alien bounty hunters, appeared from the shadows of the market. Their armor glinted in the low light, and their weapons were drawn, scanning the area. They had arrived. The girl's eyes widened in panic as the soldiers advanced toward her. "They found me," she whispered, almost to herself. Ray knew he had little time to think. Without a second thought, he stepped forward and grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the back of a nearby building. They ran, her feet stumbling behind him, but Ray didn't dare look back. The bounty hunters were close, too close. "Come on," Ray shouted, his voice urgent. They darted into a small alley between two collapsed walls. The girl stumbled but managed to keep up, her breath quick and sharp as she struggled to keep pace. Ray was certain the soldiers would catch up any second, but just as they reached a dead end, something strange happened. The girl stopped running, her expression shifting from fear to determination. She turned to Ray, her eyes pleading. "Please," she begged, her voice low but filled with urgency. "I don't want to die. Let me serve you. Let me be yours." Ray hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. His mind was racing, but then, with no time to overthink, he made a decision. "All right," he said, looking her in the eyes. "You can come with me, but we need to move fast." The girl nodded, a glimmer of hope returning to her face. She wasn't just begging to serve him out of desperation. She was clinging to the last shred of her dignity, her only chance at survival. As the sound of the bounty hunters grew louder, Ray pulled her with him into his ship, the small vessel hidden behind an old cargo crate. He could hear the soldiers shouting in the distance, but they were too late. Ray closed the hatch and launched the ship into the skies, the engines roaring to life as they sped into the vastness of space. For now, they were safe. But Ray knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning of a journey neither of them could have predicted. The girl, once a noble, now a fugitive, had come into his life for a reason. He just didn't know what that reason was yet. All he knew was that, for better or worse, their fates were now intertwined. And as the stars blurred past them, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was about to unfold. Ray sat in the cockpit, his hands gripping the controls as the ship glided through the cold expanse of space. His eyes scanned the navigation console, but his thoughts were miles away, caught in the web of uncertainty that had woven itself around him ever since he met her. Nova, the alien girl who had pleaded for his help, now sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the viewport as stars streaked by in a blur of light. She was silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though she were afraid to move or even breathe too loudly. Ray couldn't stop thinking about her story, the one she had shared so reluctantly, the truth she had revealed about herself. She had once been a noble, a princess of some kind, living in luxury, her world turned upside down by the actions of her own family. It was a story he had heard before, in countless variations, but something about the way she told it made it feel real, raw, and impossibly tragic. Her brother had tried to do the right thing, trying to free those who were enslaved by their people, but he had failed. And when he died, Nova was left with nothing but her escape. But even now, Ray couldn't shake the question that had been nagging him ever since he agreed to take her in. Why me? It wasn't that he didn't want to help. He had been raised to be kind, to give people a chance. But why had Nova chosen him? Why had she begged him to take her in, to let her serve him? She was beautiful, strong, and capable. So why had she fallen to her knees in front of him, a simple human engineer? He wasn't anyone special. He wasn't royalty or important in any way. He didn't even know if he could protect her from the bounty hunters that were likely still chasing them. He glanced over at her, his thoughts momentarily pulled from his confusion. She was staring at the stars outside, her face expressionless. Her eyes, though, betrayed her. They were filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place, pain, perhaps, or fear. She was always so calm, almost detached, but there was something behind that quiet facade. Something he didn't understand yet. "Hey," Ray said, his voice breaking the silence. She turned her head toward him, her violet eyes catching the dim light from the cockpit. "How are you holding up?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at him for a long moment before slowly shaking her head. "I'm not used to being a burden," she said quietly. "I was once powerful. I had everything. And now, I'm nothing." Ray frowned. "You're not nothing. You're here with me. And that counts for something." He didn't know why he said it. Maybe it was because of how vulnerable she looked in that moment, so small and fragile. Or maybe it was because he didn't want to see anyone feel that way. "You've been through a lot, and you're still standing. That's something." Nova didn't respond right away, but the faintest flicker of gratitude passed through her eyes. She glanced away again, turning her focus back to the stars. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted, almost to herself. "I can't go back. I can't ever go home. I'll be hunted for the rest of my life. Ray turned his chair toward her, his gaze softening. You don't have to go back. We'll figure this out together. I can help you. He wasn't sure how, but the words felt right. Something about this girl, no, woman, felt different from anything he had ever known. She wasn't just an alien fugitive. She was a person who had lost everything. And Ray felt that ache deep inside of him, resonating in ways he didn't fully understand. Nova's lips trembled, but she managed a small smile. I don't deserve help, she whispered. Not after what I've done. I broke the rules. I betrayed my own people. I left them behind. Ray shook his head, his voice firm. No one deserves to be alone like that. No one deserves to carry the weight of their past forever. He paused, searching her face for any sign that she might believe him. And you didn't betray anyone. You stood up for what was right, even when it cost you everything. She didn't speak again, but her shoulders seemed to relax, if only a little. It was a small step, but it was something. For the first time since they had met, Ray felt like they were making some kind of connection, even if it was fragile. But that was the thing. He had no idea where it would go. They were from different worlds, different cultures, different lives. She had been taught to see him as beneath her, as a lowly human, and now he was supposed to help her escape from the very system that had betrayed her. But what if it wasn't just about helping her? What if somehow this was about finding something for himself too? Something bigger than just his usual quiet life on the edge of space. Something more meaningful than any amount of mechanical repairs or quiet solitude. Could he be the one to change her fate? Could he be the one to show her that not everyone in this galaxy was out to use her? Before he could contemplate that thought further, the ship's alarm blared, pulling him back to the present. Ray. Nova's voice was sharp, filled with urgency. They found us. They're here. His heart skipped a beat. The bounty hunters. The ones who had been tracking her. He quickly spun in his seat, hands flying over the controls. Brace yourself, he shouted. The ship's thrusters roared to life as he slammed the throttle forward, the vessel surging into hyperspace. Nova grabbed onto the side of the seat, her face pale but resolute. Ray's fingers danced over the console, locking in evasive maneuvers as the ship darted through the stars, but he could already hear the loud hum of pursuit. The bounty hunters were close, too close. Can you do anything? Ray asked, his voice tight with fear. Nova's eyes flashed with determination, but she remained silent for a moment. Then, without warning, she stood up, her hands moving in a quick, fluid motion. The air around them shimmered, bending in strange ways. Ray's eyes widened in disbelief as he saw the ship start to fade. She was using her power, the same power she had used to escape before. Hold on, Nova shouted, her voice strained. I can only keep us hidden for a short time. They'll still find us. Ray could only nod, his mind racing as he felt the ship tremble under the weight of the cloaking field. He didn't know how much longer they had, but he knew one thing for certain. They weren't safe yet, and as the bounty hunter's ship grew closer, Ray realized that no matter how fast he flew or how far they ran, they were both trapped in a game much bigger than either of them could have ever imagined. The silence in the cockpit was deafening. Ray's hands gripped the controls as the ship glided through the cold void of space, each pulse of the engines shaking him to his core. Nova sat beside him, her face drawn and pale, her eyes locked on the starry abyss outside. Her power had helped them escape for now, but Ray knew that was only temporary. The bounty hunters wouldn't stop. The price on her head would keep them coming, and as much as he wanted to keep her safe, he was starting to realize just how far this would go. We can't outrun them forever, Nova said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was hollow, and for the first time, Ray could hear the weight of resignation in it. They won't stop hunting me. They'll track us down no matter where we go. Ray glanced at her, his brow furrowed with concern. We're not giving up that easily, he replied, his voice firmer than he felt. He had no real plan, but he wasn't about to admit that to her. She was already fragile, already breaking under the weight of the world she'd lost. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel like there was no hope left. "You don't understand," Nova said, her voice catching. She turned to face him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "They'll never stop. I was born into a system that's designed to crush people like me. My family, my people, they thrive on the suffering of others. There's no escaping them, no hiding." Ray's heart clenched as he watched her struggle to keep her composure. She was so much more than just a fugitive, more than the broken girl she thought she was. She was a noblewoman, a princess of a lost world, and even now, the fear of her past haunted her. "They killed your brother," Ray murmured, almost to himself. "And they'll kill you too, if we don't do something." Nova's gaze faltered for a moment, her eyes drifting to the floor. "I should have died with him," she whispered. "It would have been easier." Ray felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "Don't say that. You're not a victim. You've already shown you're stronger than them. I saw it. You've got more courage than anyone I've ever known." She shook her head slowly, her lips trembling. "Courage doesn't change the facts. I've already lost everything. The life I knew is gone. My name, my family, they're all gone." Her voice broke, and for a moment, the quiet of the ship seemed to swallow her whole. Ray didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to seeing people like this, so vulnerable, so broken. He had always kept to himself, stayed on the fringes of things. He had never had to face such raw emotion, such a deep well of pain. And yet, here she was, clinging to him for something she couldn't name, something she didn't even know she needed. "We'll find a way out of this," Ray said, though his words felt hollow even as he said them. He didn't know how to fix what was broken. He didn't know how to fight an empire. But the thought of leaving her to face it alone was worse than anything he could imagine. He couldn't walk away. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at him, her violet eyes full of something unreadable. Then she spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always weak." She paused, as though gathering the courage to speak of things she'd kept buried for years. "I used to believe in the system, in my family's rule. But the truth is, I was just a pawn, a piece on a board I didn't even understand. And when I finally saw the truth, when I finally realized how much suffering they caused, it was already too late." Ray felt a pang in his chest. He could hear the pain in her voice, the years of regret, the weight of a decision she'd made long ago. He didn't know what it felt like to have everything stripped away like that, to be forced to confront the lies you once believed in. He didn't know what it felt like to betray everything you once held dear. "How did it happen?" Ray asked gently, his voice low. "What did your brother do?" Nova's eyes flickered with a mixture of sorrow and shame. "He was the only one who ever saw the truth," she said, her voice barely audible. "He wasn't like the others. He wanted to stop the exploitation, the slavery. He saw the way our people treated the others, how they enslaved entire worlds to feed their greed. He believed we could change. He thought we could be better." Her eyes closed, and Ray could hear the catch in her breath as she continued. "But they caught him. They caught him trying to free the slaves. And She stopped, her voice faltering, and for a long moment, Ray didn't speak. He just let her breathe, let the silence stretch between them, before he finally asked, "What happened to him?" Nova's jaw tightened. "They executed him. In front of everyone. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't stop it. I was powerless. I watched them kill him. And then, they turned on me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I was a traitor in their eyes." Ray felt his throat tighten. The weight of her story was crushing, the hopelessness of it all pressing down on him. How could anyone survive something like that? How could anyone keep going after losing everything they had ever known? She looked at him then, her eyes wide and searching. I ran as far as I could. I tried to escape, But they found me. And now I'm here, hiding in your ship, hoping for something, anything. Ray's mind raced. The realization of just how deeply she had been hurt, how far she had fallen from everything she once knew, hit him like a tidal wave. He wanted to help. He wanted to fix things for her, but he knew there was no easy solution. The empire she had fled from wasn't just going to let her go. They would keep coming until they got what they wanted. He glanced at the monitor. The trail of the bounty hunters had grown fainter, but Ray knew they weren't far behind. There was no place in the galaxy that it would be truly safe for her. No more running, Ray said suddenly, his voice steady. We're going to fight. Nova blinked, clearly taken aback. Fight. Her voice was incredulous, as though the idea hadn't even crossed her mind. How you propose we do that? We're just two people. We can't fight them. We can't fight them. Ray turned to her, his eyes hardening with resolve. I don't know how yet, but we're going to find a way. You're not alone anymore. For the first time, Nova seemed to see him, really see him, as something more than just a human who had stumbled into her life. A faint glimmer of hope sparked in her eyes, though she quickly tried to smother it. We'll need a plan, she said, her voice steadying. Ray nodded. We'll make one. As they sped through the endless black of space, the ship quiet except for the soft hum of the engines, they both knew one thing for certain. The road ahead would be long, and it would be dangerous. But Ray had made a promise, and he would keep it, no matter what it took. The stars streaked past them, a blur of white light against the dark void of space. Ray's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind racing through the endless possibilities and dangers that lay ahead. He had promised Nova they would find a way to fight, but how? The bounty hunters were relentless, and the empire that wanted her back was more powerful than anything he could imagine. There had to be a way, though. There had to be some kind of solution. He wouldn't let her face this alone. Nova sat beside him, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on the stars outside. For the first time in days, she seemed calmer, more composed. But Ray could see the underlying tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw. She was still afraid. And who could blame her? Her past had been nothing but a series of betrayals and loss. Now she was on the run again, with no safe place to call home. We're running out of time, Ray said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nova didn't answer right away. She just kept staring out into the endless expanse of space. After a long pause, she finally spoke. You don't know how bad they are, she said, her voice distant. You think I'm just a fugitive, someone they'll catch eventually. But they won't stop, not until I'm dead. Ray glanced at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. I'm not letting that happen, he said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers. I promised I'd help you. And I will. She turned away, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. You don't even know what you're up against. My family, my people, they have weapons and resources you can't even imagine. They'll find me. It's only a matter of time. Ray exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the ship's controls. The path ahead was murky, full of dangers he couldn't predict. But he wasn't about to give up. Not now, not when they were this close to something that could change everything. We'll figure something out, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. I've got an idea, but I need you to trust me. Nova looked at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to gauge his sincerity. After a long pause, she nodded slowly. All right. I trust you. Ray's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, just a small flicker of hope, but it was enough to give him the strength to press on. He turned his attention back to the ship's console, pulling up a map of nearby systems. There had to be a place they could hide, a way to get ahead of the hunters. The bounty hunters were fast, but they didn't know the galaxy the way Ray did. He had spent years traveling from one backwater world to the next, picking up odd jobs here and there. He knew how to disappear. We need to go off the grid, Ray said, his finger tapping the screen as he zoomed in on a distant system. There's a place, a hidden moon I know of. It's far enough from any major trade routes that no one will find us. The people there don't care about your past or what you're running from. They just want to be left alone. Nova raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. A hidden moon. You think that's enough to outrun them? It's not just about outrunning them, Ray replied. It's about disappearing. We lay low, get lost in the system, and let them think we're long gone. We can hide there long enough to figure out what we need to do next. Nova didn't say anything at first, but Ray could see the flicker of hope in her eyes again. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could escape the fate she had resigned herself to. All right, she said, her voice steady. Let's do it. Ray's fingers moved swiftly over the controls, inputting the coordinates for the hidden moon. The ship hummed as the engines powered up, and in an instant, they were off again, speeding away from the bounty hunter's pursuit. Ray kept his eyes on the monitors, watching as the ship's sensors indicated the growing distance between them and the tracking signals. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As they approached the hidden system, the atmosphere in the cockpit grew thick with anticipation. Ray could feel his pulse quicken, the tension rising as the ship entered the system's outer rim. There were no major stations, no thriving colonies, just cold, desolate moons and asteroids. The kind of place where no one would look twice if a ship appeared out of nowhere. Almost there, Ray said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's engines. He could see the moon now, a small forgotten world drifting silently in the dark. There were no signs of life, no civilization, just an old mining colony that had been abandoned years ago. They entered the moon's orbit, the ship's thrusters humming as they slowed to a crawl. Ray brought the ship in low, his hand steady as he navigated through the barren landscape. The surface of the moon was jagged and rough, a rocky wasteland with deep craters and broken buildings scattered like ruins. "Welcome to our new home," Ray said, his tone a little more lighthearted than he felt. He glanced at Nova, but her face remained unreadable, her eyes distant as she took in the barren world below. "This place is empty," Nova said quietly. "It's like no one's been here for centuries." Ray nodded. "That's the point. No one will bother us here. We can stay hidden until we figure out what comes next." He landed the ship with a soft thud, the landing gear settling on the rocky surface. The ship's lights flickered for a moment before stabilizing, and Ray let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "All right," he said, looking at Nova. "We're safe for now. We can rest. But we need to be careful. No one can know we're here." Nova stood up slowly, her gaze fixed on the hatch as the ship's airlock doors hissed open. She hesitated, taking a deep breath before stepping toward the exit. As she reached the door, she turned back to Ray. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." Ray gave her a small smile. "It's not over yet. We got a lot more to figure out. But for now, we rest." With that, they both stepped out into the cold silence of the forgotten moon. The winds howled through the crumbling ruins, but there was no one here to hear them. They were alone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ray allowed himself to believe that they might actually have a chance to escape, if only for a little while. The silence of the moon was overwhelming, almost suffocating. Ray stood at the entrance of the ship, his gaze sweeping over the barren landscape that stretched out before him. The wind stirred the dust in soft swirls, and the once dominant mining colony lay in ruins behind him, forgotten by time and buried under the weight of history. It had all the makings of a perfect hiding place, a place where no one would think to look. And yet, as he turned back to the ship, the weight of their situation pressed heavily on his chest. The bounty hunters weren't far behind. They were still out there, hunting, relentless and determined. Ray knew they couldn't stay here forever. As much as the quiet and the isolation felt like a brief reprieve, he could sense the clock ticking in the back of his mind. He glanced at Nova. She stood just inside the ship, her back to the cool metal walls, her violet eyes lost in thought. She hadn't spoken much since they landed. She had retreated into herself, perhaps overwhelmed by the stark reality of their situation, or simply numb to the danger that still loomed over them. Ray could see the way she moved, slow, careful, like she was trying not to break something too fragile. He knew the weight of her past was heavier than he could imagine. She had given him a glimpse into her world, told him about her betrayal, the death of her brother, and the empire she was running from. But there was still so much he didn't know, so much she had yet to tell him. Ray's instincts screamed at him to ask her more, to dig deeper into her past, but he knew it wasn't the time. They were alone now, but they would soon be forced to confront the truth, both hers and his. The question was, could they both survive it? The thought lingered in his mind as he made his way to the small table at the back of the ship, where a few scattered supplies lay. Rations, water, tools he hadn't used in months. Nova moved behind him, her footsteps soft on the metal floor. Ray turned, meeting her gaze. She didn't look like the powerful, regal figure she had described to him anymore. She looked like someone who had lost everything, someone who had been stripped of her identity, of the life she once knew. "I'm sorry," Nova said quietly, her voice tinged with guilt. Ray raised an eyebrow, confused. "What are you sorry for?" She shook her head, the gesture small and almost imperceptible. "For dragging you into this. You didn't have to help me. You should have just left me on that planet." Ray felt a flicker of something deep inside him. Anger, disappointment, or was it pity? He couldn't tell. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was here, with him, and he wasn't going to let her slip away because she thought she didn't deserve help. "You're not a burden," he said, his voice steady but softer than he intended. "I made the choice to help you. You didn't drag me into anything. I don't regret it." Nova met his gaze, her lips trembling as she fought to suppress the emotion she kept locked away. Her eyes flickered with something like gratitude, but there was still a wariness in them, a hesitance that told Ray she didn't fully believe she could trust him. "I don't know how much longer we can keep running," she said, her voice faltering just slightly. "I can't keep hiding. I can't keep being this person I've become. I used to be more than this." Ray took a step closer to her, his eyes narrowing in concern. He had heard her words, but now he needed to know what they meant. "What do you mean?" Nova hesitated before answering. Her eyes shifted away from his, staring down at the floor as though the words were too heavy to speak aloud. "I was a princess. I was meant to lead my people. I had power, wealth, a purpose. But now, I'm just a fugitive, a failure." She took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I'm supposed to be." Ray stood there for a long moment, processing her words, his mind turning over the weight of them. He had known she had once been part of something grand, something that had shaped her into the person she had been. But he hadn't understood just how much that loss had broken her. To lose not just a family but an entire identity, a life she had built around power and purpose, it was too much for anyone to carry alone. "You're not a failure," Ray said, his voice rough with the conviction he felt in his heart. "You're still you. The person I've met. She's strong. She's a fighter." Nova met his gaze again, her eyes filled with a mixture of skepticism and longing, as if she couldn't quite believe the words he was saying. But for a brief moment, something softened in her expression. The walls she had built around herself seemed to crack just slightly, allowing a glimpse of the woman she used to be, or perhaps the woman she could still become. "We need to figure out our next move," Ray said after a long pause. "We can't just keep hiding. The hunters will find us, sooner or later." Nova nodded slowly, her expression hardening once more as the reality of their situation sank in. "I know. But where do we go? What do we do?" Ray turned to the ship's console, pulling up a map of the galaxy once again. His mind raced as he searched for a solution, a way to keep them both safe. There were so many systems, so many places to disappear to, But where could they go that would offer them any kind of protection? Ray's eyes darted over the map, skimming through the vast networks of star systems. Then his finger stopped on a small, out-of-the-way sector, barely noticeable on the map. "There's a planet," he said, his voice firm with decision. "It's not far from here, a place where no one goes. It's not much, but it's hidden. It could be our best chance." Nova looked at him, her brow furrowing. "You think we can just hide there forever?" Ray didn't answer immediately. He knew the odds. They were slim, but there was no other choice. "For now, yeah. We lay low, get off the radar. And then, we figure out how to take down the people who are hunting you." Nova studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "You really think we can do that?" Ray turned back to the controls, setting the course for the distant planet. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we have to try." As the ship's engines hummed to life, Nova sank into the seat beside him, her expression unreadable. She had been through so much, and Ray knew this was just the beginning. The path ahead would be long and filled with uncertainty, but there was something else he knew for certain. They were in this together now, whether she wanted to believe it or not. And that meant, for better or worse, they were going to have to fight for each other. The ship hummed steadily as it glided through the dark expanse of space, its engines purring with a quiet rhythm that Ray had come to find comforting. But despite the serenity of the moment, a heavy weight hung in the air, and neither Ray nor Nova spoke much. They had been on the run for what felt like forever, but as they neared the unknown planet Ray had set a course for, an unsettling feeling gnawed at him. The distance they had traveled meant nothing if they couldn't keep ahead of the bounty hunters, or worse, if Nova's past caught up to her once again. The faint glow of distant stars flickered against the blackness, offering only the briefest illusion of safety. Ray was doing everything in his power to keep them both hidden, but the reality was inescapable. The hunters weren't the only ones they needed to worry about. Nova was still running from an empire that had deep roots in the galaxy. They would not stop until she was back in their grasp. Ray glanced over at her, sitting quietly by the viewport. Her figure was illuminated by the soft light from the ship's console, but there was no mistaking the tension in her posture. She wasn't just staring out into the infinite void of space. She was lost in her own thoughts. The walls that she had so carefully constructed around herself had started to crumble, and Ray couldn't help but feel the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. "You're quiet," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. He'd gotten used to her silence in the days since they'd landed on the abandoned moon. It had been a refuge, but it hadn't come without its costs. The cracks in Nova's shield were starting to show, and it made Ray feel like they were both teetering on the edge of something they couldn't control. Nova didn't answer at first. Her eyes remained focused on the stars, her expression unreadable. Then, without looking at him, she spoke in a low voice. "I keep wondering if this is how it's always going to be. Running, hiding." Her voice was flat, resigned. "I thought I had escaped everything, escaped my past. But it's always there, isn't it? Following me, no matter where I go." Ray shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests as if he could hold on to something solid in a world that felt increasingly unstable. "No," he said firmly. "You're not just running. You're surviving. We're both surviving." Nova turned her head slightly, her eyes catching his for just a moment before drifting away again. She seemed almost detached, lost in the gravity of the words she had just spoken. "I'm not so sure anymore," she muttered, almost to herself. "I thought I was strong. I thought I was making the right choices. But every decision I've made has led me here, to you, to this mess." Ray's heart clenched at her words. He knew she felt guilty, but she couldn't see the truth of what was happening. He had seen it from the start, from the moment she had fallen to her knees and begged him for help. She wasn't weak. She was someone who had been broken by the very system she had trusted, and now she was trying to find a way to rebuild herself from the wreckage. "You're not weak," Ray said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. What you've been through, we've destroyed most people. You're still standing. That says everything about you." Nova shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Standing. I'm just trying not to fall apart, and I'm dragging you down with me." Ray's expression hardened, the frustration that had been building inside him finally breaking free. "Stop," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "Stop thinking like that. You're not dragging me down. You didn't make me do anything. I chose to help you because I want to. And I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes flickered toward him, the faintest hint of vulnerability seeping through the walls she had so carefully built. For the first time since they had met, Ray saw the rawness in her, the quiet pain that she tried to hide from the world. It was a side of her he hadn't seen before, and it hit him harder than he expected. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," she said softly, the weight of her confession hanging between them. "I used to know my place. I used to know who I was. But now I'm just this broken thing, running from everything I've ever known. And I don't even know who I am anymore." Ray's heart softened as he looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had never imagined what it would be like to lose everything. The power, the status, the sense of belonging. But Nova had lost all of that, and in its place, she had been left with nothing but fear and uncertainty. "You're still Nova," Ray said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not defined by your past. You're not just the fugitive or the princess you used to be. You're someone who's choosing to fight for herself. That's what matters." Nova turned away, her gaze falling to the floor of the ship. The weight of his words seemed to settle on her shoulders, but it was clear she wasn't ready to accept them. The pain she carried was too deep, too raw. Ray could see that. A sudden beep from the console broke the tension, and Ray's attention snapped back to the control panel. His fingers flew over the buttons, his instincts kicking in as he accessed the communication system. The message was a warning, an encrypted signal from a source he didn't recognize. His stomach tightened. There was no mistaking it. They had been tracked. "They'd found us," Ray said under his breath, the urgency in his tone impossible to ignore. Nova's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Ray's fingers hovered over the console, his mind racing. There wasn't much time. The signal wasn't just a warning. It was an indication that someone somewhere had pinpointed their location. And it wasn't just the bounty hunters this time. It was someone with far more power than that. "We need to move," Ray said quickly, his voice now full of focus and determination. He turned to Nova, his gaze locking onto hers. "We can't stay here. We need to get to that hidden planet. Now." Nova didn't hesitate. Her face hardened, the vulnerability she had shown earlier replaced with a sharp edge of survival instinct. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. Ray punched in the coordinates, and the ship roared to life as they accelerated into the blackness of space. But even as the stars blurred past them, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The galaxy was vast, but it was closing in on them, and the walls were beginning to close faster than he had hoped. They were running out of time, and this time, Ray wasn't sure if they would make it out alive. But he wasn't going to stop. He wouldn't let them stop. The ship cut through the cold expanse of space, its engines thrumming steadily as Ray navigated them toward the distant planet. His hands gripped the controls, his eyes flicking between the ship's instruments and the dark, endless void of space outside. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, a silent, ever-present weight that both of them carried. Nova sat beside him, her body tense, her gaze distant as she stared out the viewport. Ray could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. They had been running for days now, ever since they had left the moon, trying to outrun the trail of the bounty hunters who were still chasing them. But now, it was different. They weren't just running from the hunters anymore. They were running from everything. The ghosts of Nova's past, the shattered pieces of her former life, and the powerful empire she had once been a part of were all closing in, leaving them with fewer and fewer places to hide. For the first time since they'd met, Ray felt a deep, gnawing sense of uncertainty. What if they didn't make it? What if there was no escape? No place left where they could find refuge? The thought lingered at the back of his mind, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to dwell on it now. Not when Nova needed him more than ever. "We're almost there," he said, his voice steady but lacking the usual confidence. Nova didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. Her fingers tapped nervously on the armrest, a silent sign of the anxiety she was trying to contain. Ray knew she was scared. They both were. But where fear had once paralyzed her, it now seemed to fuel her determination. She had been broken before, but now she was rebuilding herself, slowly, piece by piece, and he would be there to help her, no matter what it took. As the planet's atmosphere loomed ahead, Ray's mind began to race through the possibilities. There were still so many variables, so many unknowns. The empire that Nova had fled from was vast and unforgiving, and the bounty hunters wouldn't be the only ones looking for her. The planet they were heading to was supposed to be safe, a place where no one would dare to look for them. But even if they made it there, it would only be a matter of time before someone discovered where they were hiding. The thought hit him hard, a cold realization that everything they were doing, everything he was doing to keep them safe, could be a waste. "You okay?" Ray asked, his eyes flicking over to Nova. She looked at him, her face a mask of determination, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, of exhaustion. She was running on empty, and Ray could see it. "I'll be fine," Nova said, her voice low and calm, but there was a fragility there that she didn't let show often. Ray wasn't so sure. She had been through so much, and it felt like the weight of everything was slowly starting to crush her. She had given up so much of herself, so much of who she had been, and now she was clinging to a version of herself she could barely recognize. "I know you will," he said quietly, keeping his gaze focused on the controls. "But just remember, none of this is on you. We're in this together. We'll figure it out. You don't have to carry all of it by yourself." She didn't respond, but he saw her shoulders relax just a little, as though his words had reached her, if only for a moment. The planet was now close, its surface a mosaic of craters and scattered forests. It wasn't much, nothing like the grand cities of her home world. But it was safe. It had to be. "Get ready," Ray said as he adjusted the ship's trajectory. "We'll need to land soon." Nova finally tore her gaze away from the viewport and looked at him, her eyes sharp. "Ray, what if this doesn't work?" Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear she had been trying to hide. "What if they find us? What if I'm wrong? What if I just—" "Stop," Ray said, his voice firm. "We don't know what's going to happen. But I'm not leaving, and I'm not going to let you face this alone. Not now. Not ever." Nova swallowed, her breath shaky, but she nodded. "All right." Ray couldn't remember the last time he had been so sure of anything. There was no certainty in their future, no promise that they'd make it out of this alive. But what he did know was this: they had a chance, and as long as there was a chance, he wasn't going to give up. The ship descended through the clouds, the atmosphere crackling with energy as they broke through into the lower layers of the planet's sky. The ground beneath them became clearer, rocky plains giving way to patches of green. "There," Ray said, pointing to a small clearing ahead, surrounded by thick trees and a series of jagged cliffs. It was hidden, far enough from any civilization to be unnoticed, but not so far that they couldn't find a way to survive. "That's our spot." He guided the ship down, the thrusters humming as they approached the clearing. His eyes stayed focused on the landing pad, his heart pounding in his chest as the ground came closer. "Get ready," Ray said, as they touched down with a soft thud. The ship settled into the earth, and Ray quickly powered down the engines. The silence that followed was deafening, the quiet outside mirroring the unease in his chest. They had arrived, but now came the hard part. "We're here," he said softly, glancing over at Nova, who was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her eyes scanning the landscape beyond the windows. "Yeah," she replied, her voice steady again. But Ray could see it, see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty she still carried, despite everything she had fought for. She turned toward the hatch, but before she could stand, Ray spoke again. "I'm not letting them take you," he said, his voice low and resolute. "I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe, no matter what." Nova stopped, her hand on the door, and for a long moment, she just stared at him. Ray could feel her weighing the sincerity of his words, could see her struggling with the weight of it all. She had been betrayed by everyone she had trusted, and now she had to trust him, trust that he would keep his promise. Finally, she nodded, her expression hardening once more. "Let's get to work then." They both stepped out of the ship and into the unknown, the cool air of the planet brushing against their skin as they stood at the edge of their new life. There were no promises, no guarantees, only the unspoken understanding that they would face whatever came next together. And for the first time in a long time, Ray felt a glimmer of hope, a quiet certainty that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something here, something worth fighting for. But the fight was far from over. It was only just beginning.